Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, and I hope you're all doing well. If you're new here, I live full-time in my 4Runner, traveling around, taking landscape photos, and making videos about editing, living on the road, and hopefully to raise awareness for mental health. As you can tell right now, if it's not obvious, I am currently not in the 4Runner. I'm actually house sitting for a friend, which really benefited me because it's actually pretty cold here in Colorado. But also means I get to finally sit down and do some editing videos. It's been a while, and I'm actually pretty excited to make these. So if you'd be into any of that, make sure you check out a few of the other videos on my channel and subscribe based off of that. If not, just end up liking the video if you liked it. Anyways, for this video, we're going to be taking this pretty dull image from this to this in just a few minutes, and I'm going to show you the start to finish and using this technique on not only this image, but also a few other example images. So without me further talking, let's jump into Lightroom now. All right, so before we begin, you're going to notice throughout this edit, we're going to use these presets that you can see on the left side of Lightroom. These come from my Lightroom editing companion guide that you can check out down below. And the whole point of this is that editing is not a really linear workflow, but I've created this set of tools that we're going to use that kind of mimics the way I work in Lightroom and the way I edit all of my images. And we're going to use that to help us guide through the image. Just check it out down below and it'll explain anything you need, or just watch this edit and you can kind of see how it works. So on the left-hand side, you see where it says find direction, no editing, and then it asks us 5 questions. So for every question in there, I have a full explanation on the companion guide for this, but realistically, all we're asking ourselves is, what does this image need? A lot of the times I encounter a lot of photographers that struggle in answering what an image needs. They might know all the tools, they might know what all the sliders do in Lightroom, they just don't know what it needs. So to keep things simple, this particular image, when I look at it, has a lot of cool elements. I like a bit of the lines crisscrossing in it. I like the balance of the mountain with the clouds and the 2 foreground mountains. But realistically, it just lacks a lot of dynamics. So that's what we're going to try to add in with our edit. Let's get started. Okay, so the first thing I do is under initial adjustments, I'm going to check the black levels, see how much detail is in those shadows. It looks like we have a decent amount of detail, but it is a little bit noisy in there, but that's okay. The next thing I'm going to do is check my highlights. All I'm doing is hovering over, and this is just to see how much data I'm actually working with. The next step is spot removal, but for this particular image, we don't need to do any spot removal. And our next setting is going to set our white balance and set our color profile. So all that did is change our profile to Adobe Landscape, and I'm not entirely in love with this white balance, so we're going to cool it back off. Let's actually go in here and maybe white balance it based off of there. No, we're going to cool it back off. And we'll probably come back to this white balance setting. Okay, so the next setting is the calibration and HSL fix setting. All that's going to do is basically enable our color calibration and fix the blue tones there. So here's the before and after of that. If you want to know what the color calibration does, I have a full video on it here. The next setting is going to add some contrast to our image. And what's really cool about this is that it is currently set to strong contrast, but if it's too much, I can bring it back down. If it's too little, I can bring it up with the little amount slider here. And all that's doing is coming in here and adjusting our tone curve for us. The next one is going to be our histogram adjustments. Now, for all of these settings that I'm using on the left-hand side, these aren't set for this particular image. A lot of the times I'm helping guide you in knowing that when you click on the histogram adjustments, you have to adjust those for your particular image. In this particular image, it'll always apply these settings. So I'm going to reset some of these, but I already know that some of them are correct, or at least in the right direction. I think I want to bring up the shadows a little bit more. And all I'm really paying attention to is recovering the stuff that's in the histogram. So if I undo adding this whole adjustment, you'll notice that the histogram before we start is pretty dark here. And a lot of the stuff is going into the blacks. We don't really need to recover any highlights. We actually need to add some light back into the image. So I'm going to hit histogram adjustments, and then I'm going to come in here like I was doing before. We're going to brighten up the image just a little bit. We're going to bring up the shadows a bit and let the highlights roll. And let's bring up the whites. Actually, yeah, this is looking pretty good. Okay, that's a good starting point for our image. That's the entire point for that. The next step is the pre-crop. We're not going to crop this image. It's already exactly how it should be cropped, just in the 2:3 format when I took it. We might adjust it slightly at the end, but right now I think it's pretty good. Okay, so this is where the magic happens. This is where we're going to add that radio filter to help any edit that you have. It's going to really create dynamics in your image. It's going to create a source of light, and it's really going to make your image pop and add a lot of, I don't know, tonal contrast. It's going to act like there's a source of light coming in. And what you should notice about this image is that there is a bit of light already naturally coming in here on the left-hand side. So we're going to play with that. We're going to add to that because that's naturally where it's coming in the first place. So to do that, I'm going to come down here and click on my pseudo sunlight mask. And that's going to add a radial filter that I'm going to go in here to my masks, go to pseudo sunlight, and it's now created a source of light here. I'm going to zoom out. That's zooming in. I'm going to zoom out so I can kind of adjust where this is. And you're going to see how that's really affecting the entire image. So I kind of want this to come down, maybe like that. Pull it up here. And then the other gradient that you're going to see in here is the control gradient. And that all that would do is just kind of help you control a little bit of that brightness on the edge of the screen. You don't have to use this. It's just there in case you want it. I'm actually going to hide it for this image because I don't need it. Then we're going to come in here, and even though I think this looks a little bright right now, I'm going to leave these settings that are applied with the pseudo sunlight setting. I'm going to come in here and actually decrease the exposure in my whole image. Something along those lines is, maybe that's too dark. Let's go here. And then I'm going to bring up the whites of my whole image. Yeah, about like that. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. So just with that mask alone, actually this whole edit, if I do the before, this is the before, and this is where we're at. And realistically, you could almost stop right here, but there are a few more improvements that we can do to this image. Another thing is I want to add more pop to this mountain. And right now, those brightness values and colors are kind of blending in from the mountain and the sky. So the next thing I'm going to do is do a sky balance mask over here on my build edit tab. And all that's going to do is add a mask that not only selects the sky, but also a graduated neutral density filter sky. And you get to balance between those two. I don't always use both of them, but for this one, we're only going to use the selected sky. So I'm going to turn off the graduated neutral density sky. We're going to go into selected sky. And then I'm going to change a few of these settings to kind of get it where I want. And you can tell in the sky, it adds a little bit of warmth and a little bit of red to the sky. And I think that's okay for now. We can bring the highlights down a little bit more. And then I'm actually going to go back in and change the color temperature of the overall image because it's looking still a little bit too warm. So something to note about that sunlight is that it's adding a bit of warmth. You can tell 15 temperature and 10 tint to that mask. And if I reset this, you can tell it's way cooler. But naturally, when you think about sunlight, it's adding a bit of warmth in where it's affecting. And it's adding this really nice roll off. So you can tell right where the sun is on the left-hand side, it's warmer, and then it cools off as you get further away from where the light source is. I really like this effect. Obviously adjust this accordingly to your image, but we're going to leave it on here for now. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is these aspen trees are just a little bit too dark. So we're going to come in here and go to our specific color adjust mask, and that's going to create a mask in here called specific color adjust, but we need to select the color that we want to affect. So we come in here where it says change color. We select our color range, and then I'm just going to add a little dropper here on the aspens. And then while holding Option or Alt on a PC, I'm going to refine this to let it affect bigger areas because I really want it to affect basically any of the aspens that are possibly in the image. And the next thing I'm going to do is bring up the whites quite a bit there and bring up the exposure. Maybe that's a little bit too much. And maybe bring down the color temp. I don't need it to be that much warmer. Let's bring up the whites a little bit more. And let's bring up the exposure just a little bit. And we can tell if I turn this on and off, it's just adding a touch of light to those aspens. Maybe it's a little bit too strong right now, but for now I'm going to leave it for example's sake. So I think this is looking pretty good. I think the last couple things I want to do is add some dehaze and clarity to the image. Recently, I've been adding a little bit of dehaze and subtracting a little bit of clarity from my images, which is exactly what this particular mask does over here, or sorry, excuse me, setting, where it's called Soft Punch. All it does is address your dehaze and clarity, but realistically, a lot of these are here for reminders of things you can do to your image. So for this image, we're going to do a little bit less clarity, a little bit more dehaze, and we're actually going to come back into our selected sky and play with the dehaze in the selected sky because it's looking a little bit too blue, I think. I think this is looking pretty good. I think overall the image is actually a little too blue. I like a little bit of the shadows here to be blue, but I don't want the whole image to be blue. That looks a little bit better. Let's go back. Like I said, editing is kind of a dance. So a lot of the times you'll set one setting and you need to go back and adjust another setting. And right now I'm trying to balance the snow that's on the mountain with the clouds that are in the background. I don't want the clouds to look too warm in comparison to the snow. Otherwise, it's just not going to look natural. So I'm going back to my selected sky here, and I'm actually going to cool off the sky. Well, that's a little bit too much. And I think I'm actually going to remove a bit of this red. And I think that's looking a little bit better. I think we need to add one more thing to this image, and it's kind of brighten up this top right corner because it's a little bit too dark. And the reason that's happening is because our sunlight is not actually hitting right there. Now what I could do is come in here and actually adjust the size of this light ray, but I'm going to leave it because I like it the way that it's affecting the foreground. And instead, I'm just going to come up here and create a linear gradient in this corner of the image. And all we're going to do is bring up the whites just a little bit. And then I'm actually going to bring down the dehaze slider, and it's going to brighten up that whole part. And then I'm going to actually drop down the highlights just a little bit. Now, if we turn that mask on and off, you can tell it's just brightening up that part of the image. Let me go to here. You can tell it's just brightening up that part of the image ever so slightly, maybe even a little bit more. Let's bring up the whites just a little bit more. And it's really adding a little bit of balance to that section of the image. I think that looks pretty good. Okay, so we're going to come over here to our Finalize tab, and the last thing we're going to do is just check a few of our colors. Realistically, a lot of the times when you're adding saturation and you're adding different color temperatures and you're balancing everything like we just did, sometimes colors can become overly saturated. So when I go to Balance Saturation and HSL here, it actually removes about 15 saturation. That's typical for my images, but on this particular image, I don't think we're too worried about saturation. We can actually just go to about -5. And then I'm going to come into my HSL and make sure everything is looking good here. I do want some more blue in the image, maybe not that much. Let's do -10. And I'm really paying attention to the shadows down here. Oh, one other thing we could do if we wanted to, I also have a added dehaze effect in this build your edit. So if you go over here to haze removal, it's another mask. And the way this works is it kind of only affects, or is supposed to only affect, the darkest, haziest parts of your image. So this is going to be a little bit better than the dehaze slider, so it's not affecting your whole image. So if I wanted to, I could come in here, select this area, which is where a lot of that haze is, and it's basically just going to color range mask that area. Now if I turn this on and off, you can see that it's really balancing out those areas where it has a little bit of haze, and it's kind of making it look more natural. I don't necessarily know if it's necessary for this image, but I do like the way it looks, so we're going to leave that on. Okay, I think overall the image is looking pretty good. Here was our start. Here's where we're at right now. And the last things I want to do is come in here. Like I said, we're currently in the phase of balancing our light and balancing our colors. A lot of the times I would step away from the image and I would come back to it. That's always my best suggestion. In this case, I've already done that, and I know that this is looking pretty good. So if I wanted to sharpen in Lightroom, I would select Sharpen in Lightroom, and that's going to do everything for me with a lot of the settings that I use. And if I wanted to sharpen externally, it's going to prep my image to be taken into Topaz or On1 sharpening or any of your external sharpening software. So anyways, that's the entire edit. You saw how we kind of use this guide on the left-hand side of Lightroom. That's my editing Lightroom companion. Every step of this has an explanation if you want to check it out, and down below there's some examples of what it does. I'm really proud of it, and I think it's something that would thoroughly help people from beginner levels all the way to advanced. I think creating a workflow, and it really helps develop a lot of good habits in your editing, regardless of where you're at in your journey. Okay, now that I've talked about that, let's check out a few more examples. So I'm going to show you a couple more, but I'm not going to do the full edits, otherwise we'd be here for too long. So in this example, I have 2 radial gradients using the exact same radial gradient mask that creates in each part of this image. And you can tell that the settings are pretty extreme. So we've got exposure by 1, we got highlights -30, we got whites 45, pretty extreme settings. But when I turn this whole mask on and off, you can really notice a difference in how much it's adding the dynamics to this image. And I basically just have 2 big sources of sunlight. So if I zoom out here, this radial gradient is a little beam of light here, and this little radial gradient is a beam of light here. And then I have a linear gradient here that's just kind of controlling right at the edge because it'll get a little bit too bright right there. And I think this effect is really nice. So just so you're clear, because I may have not explained it enough in the last image, all you're really doing, if you want to do this yourself, is come in here, create a mask, create a radial gradient, make it really big off screen, and then just put it where it would naturally be in terms of the sun. That's obviously going to be dependent on any image you're using. So in this one, the sunlight is coming from the top left. That was just how the image was taken. But for example's sake, if I was making it for this image, this is my big source of sunlight. I would go over here and increase my whites by a bit. I would bring down the dehaze. I would bring up the exposure by quite a bit, and that would create my source of sunlight. Like I said, a lot of the times I edit these depending on the photo, and these you can see that there's a bit of warmth from the sunlight, and you can see all the settings for that. So a few more quick examples is, let me show you this one. Let's zoom back in here to fit it on the screen. And if I turn on my sunlight here and turn it off, you can tell that that's really just adding a bit of dynamics and just kind of, I don't know, it's making this image stick out and pop a little bit more. I think even before the sunlight here, you can tell that this is a pretty high key image. There was a lot of haze in the sky, and I kind of just wanted to accentuate that using this little sunlight mask. Okay, a few more. Let me turn this one on and off. We actually have one coming from the right-hand side here, where I used a radial filter right here, and then a linear gradient here to remove it from the sky a bit so that it's a little bit more controlled, if you will. And it's kind of just creating a bit of light in a beam right there on the mountains. So if I turn this off, you really notice how much it's brightening up that section of the image and really adding a bit of emphasis on those mountains. And then I also have a big one coming from the bottom of the screen down here. And this one is really big. It's actually more like affecting the entire image, but it's still creating some nice roll off on the image. So if I were to turn this off, and you can tell what that's kind of doing, and then just go in and try to edit my image and brighten some whites and add some contrast in, it's going to affect the entire image. And by using a little radial filter like this, it's really adding dynamics. It's adding natural, brighter parts to the bottom of the image and then rolling off by the top of the image. And I really like that effect. Okay, so last but not least, let's look at this image. It basically does the exact same thing. I have a mask at the bottom of the screen, and instead of brightening the entire image, so if I turn this mask off, come in here and increase my exposure within the image to something like this, this isn't bad looking. But if I compared that to this with the mask on, where it's brightening up the image in the exact same way, but it's creating more dynamics in the image. It's creating more contrast at the bottom of the screen and less at the top, but it's creating a more natural look to your image. And my last example, we're even going to go over to Lightroom for desktop. So this is kind of the mobile-ish version of Lightroom, but it's obviously on the desktop. This is the same interface that you would find on your tablet or phone. And we're going to add a radial filter, just like we just did. So that editing companion down below also works in Lightroom for desktop or Lightroom mobile. So I'm going to actually come over here to my presets, and we're going to add a pseudo sunlight mask. And then we're going to come into our mask and we're going to need to change it around because it's always going to put the mask in the same spot. So we just need to adjust it for where it should be in our image. Come down here to zoom out a bit. We're going to move it to where the brightest part of the image is and where the light was actually coming from. We're going to adjust it down here. Let's stretch it down so it's affecting more of the water. And that's looking pretty good. So if I turn this on and off, let me move this out of the way. We're actually not going to use the control for this image. I don't think we need it. Click on fit and turn this on and off. See how it's creating that nice source of light in the top part of the corner where it's kind of already naturally coming from. It's just pretty dark. So we're adding the light to the top of the image and it's really creating a nice effect. Maybe we need to brighten it even more. Let's do that. Let's bring up the exposure a bit. Let's bring up the whites even more. And then I'm actually going to come down here and we're not going to warm it up too much because this is a pretty cold image. So let's bring that down a little bit. And I think that's looking pretty good. Turn that on and off. And it really adds dynamics to the image. Also notice how it gently affects the leaves in the foreground here. It's really subtle, but it's adding just a nice touch of light to those leaves while affecting the waterfall really well in the ways that you kind of want it. And then kind of creating like a big bright light source in the top right of the corner. Okay, so that's pretty much it. You saw me edit that image from start to finish using my editing companion, but like I said, that's just my natural workflow. A lot of those just save me steps and they save me time, but they mostly really help develop your skills as an editor. So like I said, check that out down below if you'd be interested. And if you like this video, like it, consider subscribing if you loved it, and I'll see you again on the next one. Later.